Good afternoon, everyone. Today for the Google Talks, the Talks at Google program, we're very thrilled to be talking about absolute value, what really influences customers in the age of nearly perfect information. Today we're taking an in-depth look at behavioral decision-making and consumer choice. Guiding us through this talk will be Professor Itamar Simonsen and Emanuel Rosen. Itamar is actually a professor at the Stanford Graduate School of Business and one of the most influential and cited researchers in the area of decision making and marketing, and he's discovered some of the phenomena himself described in various journals, including the compromise effect. And we're also joined by Emanuel Rosen, the author of the national bestseller The Anatomy of Buzz, a pioneering book that predicted the rise of interpersonal influence in marketing, and his research appears in numerous journals as well. And so we will have time for some Q&A at the end. Please use the microphones, but without further ado, we'll launch right in. So thank you very much. Please join me in welcoming them to Google.
And thanks for your patience. Today we'd like to talk about consumer decision-making in the age of nearly perfect information. But before we get there, let's take a moment to talk about what we used to believe about consumers. In the beginning, the assumption was that consumers are generally rational, but because they cannot tell the quality of things, marketers can influence them using advertising and branding and building loyalty and all those other things that you might have read in marketing textbooks. Then about 30 years ago, it got a little more interesting, and more studies that we have done have shown that consumers often make decisions that are irrational. By irrational, contrary to the common concept or conception of irrationality, what we mean by irrationality is that we violate assumptions of economics. People do not maximize utility, and sometimes they choose A over B, other times they choose B over A, even though it's the same A and B. I spent the first 20, 25 years of my career working on the irrationality of consumers. This is an article that I published back in 1994 in the New York Times, and I think the title of the article tells you what it was about and who I thought was in control. Let me just give you a couple of examples of effects, irrationality effects. So in this particular study, we showed one group of consumers those two microwave ovens. We asked them to make a choice. You see there is one that's the Emerson that's less expensive and a Panasonic that's more expensive. Both of them are 35% of the regular price. A second group of consumers chose among three microwave ovens. You note that the top one is the same one that we saw before. The bottom one is the same one that we saw before. But now there is a third option, which is another Panasonic. It's even more expensive, has more features, but it's only 10% off. Okay? What did we find? We found that consumers were more likely to choose the Panasonic over the Emerson in this group than in the other group, even though we added another Panasonic here to the choice set. Okay? That's known as the asymmetric dominance effect, because this Panasonic is dominated by this Panasonic. Since then, those effects have been shown many times. Now, a year ago, a doctoral student at Stanford, Tali Reich, and I tried to replicate the asymmetric dominance effect, except that in this case, we provided consumers or participants in the study additional information, the kind of information that you receive today when you're going to shop on Google Shopping or Amazon or any other website. We showed them some reviews, we showed them other options, we showed them more detailed specifications, and so on. So some people chose between these two paper shredders, and other respondents saw these three shredders, and you don't see here all the information they received. As I said, they received a great deal more information. What did we find? We found that now the asymmetric dominance effect was gone. Okay? consumers no longer made a choice on the basis of comparing the options in front of them. Instead, they took advantage of all the other information we presented to them. As we will explain later, we would connect it to a broader phenomenon whereby consumers are much less likely to make judgment relative to the options you show them and relative to all kinds of other things like other products by the same brand, and instead they evaluate each product individually. So this is a really fundamental change in decision making. Let me give you another example. This is something to do with frequency programs. This is based on a study that Ran Kivitz, who at the time was a doctoral student at Stanford, is now professor of marketing at Columbia. So we looked here at whether participants, they didn't even know they were participating in a study, would sign up for this loyalty program. So we told them, these were students at Columbia, we said, if you join this program, after you buy 12 sandwiches in any food place on campus, you, at the end of the day, you'll get 2 free movie tickets. A second group of participants were told that if they buy 12 sandwiches and they also buy 12 orders of sushi, they will, at the end of the day, get 2 free movie tickets. Now, which program is more attractive? The first one. This one requires you to buy 12 sandwiches and also 12 orders of sushi for the same reward. Okay? Now, we asked all of the participants about the kinds of food they like or dislike, so we could identify the segments of what we called sushi lovers. Okay? For those, what we found was they were more likely to join this program than the other program. Why? We call that the idiosyncratic fit heuristic. What we're saying is that people really cannot assess the value of a program or how you translate effort to reward. Instead, what they do, they assess the reward relative to the effort that it would require from other participants. And they say to themselves, I really like sushi. I buy sushi anyway. This is relative to others, this is more attractive for me. And as a result, those people who like sushi were more likely to prefer the frequency program that required you to buy both 12 sandwiches and 12 orders of sushi. That's another example of making decisions relative to other things, in this case, relative to other consumers. This is what Cliff mentioned, the compromise effect, okay? So what I worked on many years ago, about 30 years ago for my dissertation, I looked at what later called the compromise effect. So some participants in the study, in this case, chose between 2 cameras. That's actually from a study done later in 1990. And you see there are two models of Minolta, which those of you who are old remember there was such a brand, and different number of features and different price level. Other people chose among 3 cameras. You know that the first 2 are the same as those before, but now there is another one that has even more features and is more expensive. Well, what did we find? We found that most consumers shifted to the middle option. The big loser was the cheapest option, okay? And there is a general tendency of people to converge on the middle option in a given set. Again, this is relative decision making. Why? Because it means that you are not basing your decision on the quality and value of the particular option. Instead, you're looking at other options, and on that basis, you make your decision. Again, last year, we tried to replicate this effect. And we used, again, cameras, different cameras, same design. And as I said earlier, we provided more information. We also gave them reviews, and we gave them specifications and additional information, the kind of information you easily obtain today. The compromise effect was gone. Now, the significance of this effect goes far beyond the compromise effect and the other effects that I talked about. It means that there is a general trend that Emanuel and I are calling the shift from relative to absolute decision making. If you think about it, suppose you were buying a laptop back in '99. You might have based your decision on the brand, on where it was made. You might have used some general rules such as you get what you pay for. These are all relative proxies or quality proxies. Why? Because you compare this product that you're thinking of buying to other products by the same brand, other products at the same price level, and other products in the same country of origin, and so on. You're not making your decision on the basis of your evaluation of the quality of this particular product. Now, the problem with quality proxies is that they're often inaccurate because some brands make good products and bad products. And that's true for all kinds of other quality proxies. Now, what has changed? These are just a few of the sources of information that you have today to assess the real value of each individual product. Okay? It means that today you don't have to rely on relative proxies. Instead, you can evaluate each product individually. Okay? Now, this is a very important change. If you think about, if you've ever taken a marketing course or read any marketing textbook, you know that much of what we teach in marketing is about the creation of quality proxies, how to build brands, how to create customer loyalty, all of those things that are really, that represent quality proxies or relative quality proxies. And we say that they're becoming, in many product categories, much less important. Now, let's simplify and talk about what are the main forces that influence consumer decision making. One we call O. O stands for what you learn from others. For example, a friend of yours tells you about a good restaurant or a good movie. That would be an example of O. P is what's in your head from prior experience, what you were born with, your family background, what you have done before, anything already stored in your head. We call that P, or prior. And the third one is M, which is the influence of marketers, advertising, brands, and so on. These three sources of information together influence what you know and how you evaluate products. If you want a summary of what has happened in the past 10, 15 years, it's the rise in the impact of O through reviews, through the easy access to expert reviews, social media, and so on, at the expense primarily of marketers, of M. Because if you can assess the quality of each product individually, you're less likely to rely on what marketers are telling you about the product. And as we know, they have their own interest to promote those products. So one thing to think about it is what we call the O continuum. And what we're saying is that the degree to which O influences consumer decisions is a function of the product category. So there's some product, before you buy a Snickers bar or before you buy paper clips, you probably are not going to bother to read reviews. On the other hand, if before you buy cameras, you may very well will. It also varies by segment. Some consumers are more likely to look for reviews than others. It also depends on context. If you buy a product on a website like Amazon, like it or not, you'll be staring at reviews, so therefore they are likely to influence you. So there are different factors that determine the impact of O on your decisions. The rest of our talk will focus on this end, which is all of those categories and situations where consumers make decisions largely based on O and what others are saying, consumers and experts. We'll now quickly review some of the key marketing mantras or the key marketing principles that are influenced by this shift from relative to absolute decision making. Let's start with branding. And there's probably nothing more marketing than branding. And this is the topic where we're saying all kinds of, we think, surprising things in the book, among other things, this notion that consumers are becoming a little more rational, even though nowadays there is a lot more talk about consumer irrationality. There's really nothing that generated greater response than this notion that brands in many product categories are becoming less important, especially as indicators of quality. Some people, in fact, are saying that if anything, brands are becoming more important. Why? They say, well, there's so much information out there on the internet that consumers experience information overload. And as a result, what they have to do, they just go by brand. This argument assumes that consumers have just two options. Either you process all the information out there, or you go by brands. Of course, in reality, there are a lot of good intermediate solutions. You don't have to process all the information. In fact, you can make very good decisions and get a great deal of information in a few seconds. And I'll illustrate that in a second. Let's think about restaurants. In the past, chain restaurants had a significant advantage because you knew what you're getting regardless of location, okay? Even if, for example, if you're out of town. However, think about nowadays if you're looking for information about individual restaurants. This particular one is a restaurant from Seattle, Machiavelli. If you're interested in Machiavelli, you get over 400 reviews, you get over 50 pictures, photos of various dishes. You have a great deal of information. It doesn't take a whole lot of effort to get an idea of how good and how popular this restaurant is. And if you like to read a little bit of the reviews, you quickly see that one of the issues there is that there are long lines and they don't take reservations. As we can see, this new environment increases the power of independent restaurants at the expense of chain restaurants. Indeed, a study conducted by Michael Luca established that's the case, that as Yelp penetrated the Seattle market, the revenues of independent restaurants increased at the expense of chain restaurants. Now, this has far-reaching implications. For example, it means that the entry barriers to many categories are declining. As long as you have a good product, you have a chance of being successful. Think about this computer that we brought here and didn't work by ASUS.
It did work.
It did work.
Yeah.
I take it back. ASUS used to make components for other PC manufacturers, but at some point their CEO decided to sell directly to consumers under the name of ASUS. People told him, you're not going to be successful because no one knows your name and you'll need to spend a lot of money on advertising. But he thought that he has a way of doing it successfully. He just sold a good product that got excellent reviews on the internet. Some of you may remember the EPC. And indeed, it became very successful. And nowadays, ASUS is in the top 5 in categories such as laptops and tablets. It also means that previously unknown names can establish themselves as leaders in the category. You may be familiar with the recent acquisition of Google called Nest. And some of you also familiar with Roku, which is one of the leaders in the video streaming category. Previously unknown names have become very popular. It shows you that when brands are less important and each product is evaluated independently, then even known names have a chance of establishing themselves as long as they have the right product that gets the right reviews. It also means that it's easier to diversify. Now, in the past, we used to teach our MBA students that each brand is associated with certain perceived skills, so therefore, you should stay in your area of expertise. But that's no longer true, because if each product is evaluated independently, it means that you can be in all kinds of categories like LG and Samsung. And as long as you make the right products, consumers will accept it.
Hi, I'll continue with the rest of the ideas that are still very common among marketers. Itamar talked about the first one, which is brand is the most important thing. Another big one is loyalty. Talk to marketers, and they say that nurturing loyalty is the most important thing, that best investment you can make. Marketers love to talk about loyalty, promote loyalty, measure loyalty. But we're saying that when consumers can actually assess the quality of each individual product, loyalty is becoming less important. Let me tell you about my experience in buying cars throughout the 80s and 90s. So in 1985, I was a student. I got this old car. I was trying to remember how old it was, but it was really old, from my uncle. And I started driving this Volvo. Now in 1989, I was going to buy a new car or another car. The most dominant piece of information in my mind was my past experience with that Volvo. So guess what I bought? I bought a Volvo. In 1995, the same thing happened. I bought a Volvo. In 2000, I bought a Volvo, and so on. In 2012, I bought a new car, and it was truly a different experience. I remember it very vividly. I was sitting in front of my computer, cars.com, Edmond.com, reviews from users, reviews from experts, videos. Actually, I remember one video. So I was still considering Volvo. It's not that I hate Volvo, but I was looking at a video of a backup camera. When you put in reverse, you want to see, and that's a feature that I always wanted to have. And I remember how slowly, I don't know if anyone here has a Volvo, but or that particular Volvo, that the screen for the backup camera was coming up so slowly that I was saying, no, I'm not going to do that every time that I put in reverse, and I will have to wait for the car to back up. So suddenly, the way I was buying this car, I was actually assessing what it would feel like, what it would be like to actually drive a Volvo, as opposed to relying on some past experience. So loyalty is going to be less of an issue. Marketers can rely less on loyalty, which means your success is determined by your current product. The good news is that your competitors suffer from the same thing, which means that your competitive advantage here and there can be improved. That's not new, but as loyalty goes down, it's even more powerful. Measuring loyalty, and there are lots of organizations that put a lot of emphasis on measuring loyalty, is less informative, because a consumer can tell you that they're loyal, but when they go to make the decision, they are not going to rely on their past experience, but they will rely on O. The third mantra, which is Itamar essentially addressed already, but I just want to mention again, is irrationality. So in general, marketers and certainly people in academia believe that consumers are irrational, and that you can manipulate, quote unquote, their action by using the context of the offer or the framing. Again, what we're saying is that no, it's going to be less true as consumer can assess the value of each product, as Itamar just showed you. Number 4 is a big one, and this is 4 out of 6, so we're almost reaching Q&A, so think about your questions. Communication. Communication is a big area, and there are several mantras here, but I can combine them under positioning, brand awareness, persuasion are key. Still, marketers, by and large, if you open a textbook, they tell you that if you persuade, if you position it rightly, target it rightly, you will be successful. Again, we're saying, no, it's going to depend much more on the absolute value of the product. That is determined by O. So let's look at something like that is called positioning. What's the idea behind positioning? The idea is that if you're a company, you look for that area that has not been occupied previously by your competitors, and you try to associate your product with that. So Volvo stood for safety, Cadillac stood for luxury, and so on, which makes a lot of sense. But this doesn't work as well when consumers base their decisions on reviews. Let's look at an example with phones. In the past 3-4 years, there have been several attempts to position the Facebook phone. So the idea was nobody has the Facebook phone, so HTC and AT&T, I think, came up with this idea of associating the product with Facebook. Maybe it's a great idea, but the problem is that reviewers hardly ever review a product only on one feature, especially not the feature you decided that they should review it on. So I read a lot of reviews of this phone, a lot of reviews, and I don't remember maybe a handful that talked specifically a lot about this feature of Facebook. Of course, everyone mentioned it, but they also talked about the screen, the keyboard, voice. They talk about the phone. So it's much more difficult to position a product the way you want consumers to think about it. Or more in general, talking about communication, persuasion is becoming much less important. There is almost no point in trying to persuade your customers that your product is better because they go to O for that. That's O's job. They will read reviews and determine if your product is better than others. So what is your job? Your job is to promote an ongoing flow. Your job as a marketer is to promote an ongoing flow of authentic content from real users, from experts, and so on. Another concept in communication, when I worked in advertising, it was all about awareness. You want to make the consumer have Sony at the top of their mind, so when they reach the point of purchase, they'll grab the first Sony product they see. But again, you understand that when the consumer comes to a point of purchase and actually decides on reviews, this is much less relevant. It's not about creating that top-of-mind awareness. It's about generating interest in specific products. And this translates to very practical things. Do you go and buy banner ads that just say Sony? Or do you create a PR campaign, invest in a PR campaign that promotes the latest product that does this or that? And we talked already about positioning that worked when people relied on M, much more difficult when people rely on O. There is another mantra or a set of mantras in the area of market research. Overall, marketers believe that market research can predict people's choices. Well, it's less true when consumers rely on O, because here's the problem. Market research, by and large, tries to predict what people's preferences are at point A in time. So I ask you a lot of questions, and I try to understand what are your preferences. The problem is that at point B in time, you will no longer make the decision based on your preferences, but you will actually reach out to O for that information. Let me give you an example. In a 2007 study concluded, or conducted before the release of the iPhone, concluded that such convergent products are not desired by US consumers. That was a mega study done all over the world, and they determined that iPhone will not be desired by US consumers. As we know, this did not happen. The opposite happened. What was the problem? What was the problem here? The problem was that they measured P, right? People's preferences at point A in time, where consumers were actually influenced by O, that is reviews, TV coverage, what I remember David Pogg wrote about it in the New York Times, such an amazing review. All this stuff is the stuff that actually influences people. So what we see in market research, what we already see and we predict will become even more true, a shift from predicting what customers will do to actually tracking what O is saying. Because think about it. If O influences a decision, go directly to O and see what O is saying, because this is going to ultimately determine what the consumer will do. There'll be more systematic measurement of O and real-time experiments, adjustment and experiments, much more in real time than trying to predict what people will do 6 months from now or a year from now, because, again, they're influenced by other sources. The last set of mantras is in the area of diffusion of innovations. And this, I wouldn't say that it's a mantra that is shared by the whole tech sector, for example. I think that there are many companies that don't really operate that way. I suspect that Google is one of them, but let's not get into that. But there are a lot of people in high-tech marketing who still believe that you start with the early adopters and then you try to get into the early majority by addressing different niches. So I'm sure you're familiar with categories of adopters. There are the innovators, early adopters, early majority, late majority, etc. Well, this type of thinking, which was initiated by Everett Rogers, the author of Diffusion of Innovations, who I still consider him personally my mentor, and he also was a great supporter of my first book that Cliff mentioned. And it also reflects the work of a very good book called Crossing the Chasm by Jeffrey Moore. I see that some people are familiar with that. But this way of thinking was really true in a world where one thing existed, and that is uncertainty. Think about it. The moment that people can actually assess the absolute value of things, they know what they're getting into, uncertainty is resolved much faster, right? So there is much less of a need for category thinking and less of a need for a strategy where you say, okay, in order to move to the early majority, I am going to identify some niches and get into these niches. And if you look, we don't have time to get into this, but if you read in the book, we talk about how the iPad was introduced versus how the tablet PC back in 2000 was introduced by Microsoft. Two different approaches. The iPad obviously was more successful. And one reason we believe is that they let consumer niches and different groups adopt it by themselves without dictating which niche should buy it according to them. So that was a very quick overview of the different mantras. We talked about branding, that's what Itamar talked about, loyalty, irrationality, communication, market research, and diffusion of innovations. And more broadly, what we talked about in this talk, and then we'll move to Q&A, we talk about really a new era in consumer decision-making and marketing. Itamar described this shift that we believe exists from relative thinking, it's good because it's from this brand or from this country, or it costs so much, to assessing the absolute value. And what happens when this is the case, proxies for quality play a much smaller role in O-dependent areas. Again, the value is determined by O. What's left for the marketer to do? There's still, don't fire your marketing department too, yet, because marketing is still important. Marketers have to generate interest. They have to make sure there is an ongoing flow of O. And probably most important, they need to track O, analyze O, and make sure there are adjustments to provide the best products a company can provide. Thank you very much, and we'll take it now for Q&A.
Hi, my name is Michelle. I'm on the search marketing team, so my job is to make sure that folks who have a smartphone choose to search with Google, hopefully through our app. And so the point of sale for us, and this is a very important moment for Google in terms of point of sale, is not buying something with a review. It's maybe you even already have the app, or maybe you even have a choice of browsers, or maybe you're on your computer and you can open Google or you can open Bing. One of the things that we look at is, well, how do we make sure that the user chooses us at a moment? And there is no review, there is no purchase process. We're actually past that point. So we sometimes rely on the thinking of defaults, which I'm sure you know of Don Ariely's work. And we think about how do we get the user to put this thing in their tray if we're talking about an iPhone. So I was wondering if you could talk about these concepts and how they relate to a decision where you don't have that information anymore, and you make that decision very quickly, and it's one of the most important decisions that consumers make for Google.
You talk about defaults and status quo bias, which in a research on that, I mean, it kind of has been done for a long, long time, and that's certainly true. But as you said, usually you have in any point in time, you have whatever comes up, either Google or Bing or Yahoo/Bing, and that's what you use. Now, the decision that you make, it really largely depends on what, if you will, comes with your computer or what you set as the default. It's not the kind of decision that you would evaluate reviews each time. Now, there might be some differences, like Google search, if I recall correctly, has an advantage over Bing in the sense that you get the results even before you finish the search term, which I think Bing does not offer, but Bing has better social media integration. So that may be a factor that influences your choice of a search engine. I don't think that what we said about reviews would apply here. I'm not even sure that that's a matter of reviews. Let's not forget, search engine is something that you use, I don't know how many times a day? Many. Every day. Okay, so that's a very different kind of decision. Not something like camera or lots of other decisions. It's something a decision that you make all the time. You set a default, and that will determine what you decide to do. Now, it could be over time that you figure out there is another search engine that has certain advantage, and that may over time cause you to change your choice. But it's not. It's a different kind of decision, a very unique one, an interesting one. As you said, what's the default? And it's a slow changing decision. Okay, so if over time, let's say you see someone else is using another search engine and they seem to be happy, that may cause you to change your mind. It's not this traditional O environment. Brand and loyalty can mean different things. As we know, loyalty could be just a matter of habit. Like, I fly United because they have the most flights from SFO. I may like them or not like them. I fly United. Then there is loyalty that's kind of more emotional attachment. I use Google all the time. I don't think I'm emotionally attached to Google. And I think it's not that kind of category. And therefore, building the brand, I think it has some value. I think limited value. It just so happens that Google search engine is really good. And if you've been using it, you'll continue to use it unless you have a really good reason not to. But I think it's more a matter of performance or real quality and less of brand equity, in the abstract.
In the teaser for this talk, there was mentioned that your thesis is that fake reviews or spam reviews are not a problem long term. Could you elaborate on that, please?
Yeah. First of all, we think that numbers make a difference. That is, if you have 4 or 5 reviews of something, it's much easier to manipulate through fake reviews. Fake reviews are not going to disappear. There's always going to be attempts to manipulate or game the system. But overall, when you look at, remember this restaurant that Itamar showed, Machiavelli in Seattle, they have 440 reviews, I think. Extremely difficult to fake that without getting caught. So we believe that as numbers grow, reviews, the credibility of reviews as a source will grow. The host of these systems, example, in this case Yelp, have a very strong economic incentive to make sure that they curb manipulation. The reason is very simple. Yelp makes its money through advertising, right? If you stop trust Yelp because you have repeated experiences where you read reviews of great restaurants and you go there and it's terrible, you will trust Yelp less, which will mean that you won't go to Yelp next time, which means that Yelp will not be able to be viable. We think that people may switch to another source of information, but let me tell you which source it will not be. It will not be the marketer, it won't be M, as the source for information about quality. Because and it's not that marketers are perceived necessarily as crooks or dishonest. It's simply because the marketer, by definition, has vested interest, so you look for alternative sources of information. 10, 15 years ago, those were very limited. What we experienced in the past 10, 15 years is an explosion in the availability of O, and this is not going away. So you may see movement within O. People will stop trusting one source of information and will move to another. For example, if people in general stop trusting reviews from strangers, they may go to trusting something like graph search, Facebook graph search, where you can tell who that person is. Currently, there are no signs that people are not trusting reviews. In fact, there is evidence that people increasingly, but people definitely trust reviews. And the reason I believe is simple, that overall reviews do reflect the general concept of a place, the general idea about a product. Is it 100% accurate? Absolutely not. But you get an idea of what your likely experience is going to be when you read reviews.
I used to work in the games industry, and one of the factors that we always faced with introducing new consoles is a lot of parents they played Nintendo games when they grew up, so they would automatically buy them Zelda and Super Mario and 3DS and Wii and whatnot. So I guess the dominance of O over P, I don't see that all the time, especially actually in business-to-business commerce. It's almost always P as well as some O and other factors. So
there are kind of two questions. Let's talk about video games. It's clearly very O-dominated. I mean, if your friends like a game, and if Xbox is more cool than PlayStation's, whatever it's now, 4 or 5, that will certainly influence you. It may be reviews not necessarily on Amazon, but social media, just the old-fashioned word of mouth. So that certainly has been for a long time an O domain, much more so than a marketing domain. As to B2B, that's an interesting question, because it is true that as absolute value goes, B2B, let's say if you invest millions of dollars in something, you probably have consultants and you have in-house experts and so on. You could assess absolute value even before that, okay? Now, one thing where the B2B sector is lagging behind the consumer segment is that you don't have all that many review sites, okay? You have, like, let's say in enterprise software, you're beginning to see some websites, relatively small numbers, and they tend to be overwhelmingly positive, which makes them a little less useful. I think we would expect that there will be development also in the B2B arena with respect to the reliance on reviews. But they're beginning from a higher level where, especially for large purchases, they already have a pretty good assessment of absolute value.
Coming back to the first point, where if I've bought something and I really liked it, there's a very high bias. I mean, you bought Volvo 4 times over the years until you changed your mind. And if the O reinforces the P, it becomes almost automatic. It's by default. I'm going to buy this thing that I've already tried.
You are buying, you heard good things about skim milk, and you started buying skim milk, yeah, that becomes a habitual purchase. That's what you're buying. You're not even thinking about it. Many purchases, especially more substantial ones, are not decisions that you make every day. So when the time comes to buy even a new electric toothbrush, you may check reviews. In other words, for less frequent decisions that tend to be the more costly ones, that's where you see the biggest shift.
You have mentioned that the marketers traditionally were trying to influence consumers directly by creating a brand, by targeting products for specific niches. And since there is a trend for consumers to evaluate the value of each product individually rather than relative to other products, so you have mentioned that the role of marketers will be to observe the trends in O and then to make sure that the company responds to those trends. Now, my question is this. Is it foreseeable that marketers would draw a different lesson from this? And the lesson would be to attempt to influence O rather than consumers directly. And if so, what do you think would be the effect on the whole review system?
Let's not forget, marketers have to come up with good ideas. So it's not, obviously, it will not be sufficient to just, introduce products, see what customers are saying, and then revise it. You have to, as Emanuel said, market research, asking consumers what they will want in the future often doesn't work. For truly new concepts, it probably never did. But you need to come up with the right products and then be responsive. Did you?
Yeah, what I would like to add, this part of it is the answer I gave this gentleman here about marketers will try to influence, or some marketers will try to influence O in unethical ways, that is fake reviews, etc. So that's one part. Another part is very legitimate, that is, I think that indeed PR, for example, is becoming more important because you can see PR as a company's attempt to promote its point of view to O, the O that matter, that is expert reviews, the experts, and that's not a new thing, of course, but it's becoming even more important today when people rely so heavily on expert reviews and they are available so, accessing these sources is so easy. So a company that introduced a new gadget, today it's even more important than 10 years ago, even 5 years ago, to make sure the people who matter, the Engadgets of the world and the I would say tens of thousands of these bloggers and so on know about it. And you cannot ultimately influence what they will say, I would argue. Of course, you can here and there, but overall, these people, this part of O reaches a broad consensus about a product, which is another interesting thing. But of course, this trying to influence O in legitimate ways will be important, and also trying to make sure that there is an ongoing flow from current users is another important thing. Because if I go to a restaurant, or I consider a restaurant, and the last review was written in 2009, I'm probably not going to go there, right? So you need to make sure O is viable and has energy.
I don't know, a company could spend a lot of resources trying to get, say, 90% of all bloggers to write about to review their product first. Let's say there are two competing companies trying to enter a certain market. And a company A, let's say, could try to basically pay money to all the bloggers to influence their product first. It's not that they would write fake reviews. They would write real reviews, but they would write them first. So what people see mostly would be reviews for product of the company A. Now, it's not illegitimate, but it certainly would probably influence what consumers choices the consumers will make.
In theory, I'm sorry.
So the question is, does changing the domain where marketers try to create an influence from consumers directly to O, does that actually, do you think that benefits the consumers overall? Does it make things more
overall,
objective?
I think I understand the question. Overall, there is one thing that bloggers really want to have more than anything else. You know what it is? Readers. So if I start feeling that this blogger is basically giving me the party line and are really not giving me the true story. Most bloggers, if they know that there is a product and another product will come shortly after it, the first thing they'll do, they'll compare them. I mean, the bloggers want to give their followers, they want to have followers, first of all. And in order to have followers, they need to provide them with valuable information. Again, the same thing that I said about reviews. Yes, people will game the system sometimes, and it's far from being perfect. The same applies to the blogosphere as to reviews. But overall, I believe that the system does work, and blogs, reviews about products or about services overall reflect the actual experience of consumers. When they don't, people will go elsewhere, because if they're disappointed, they will not trust that source anymore. Same logic works here.
Let's have you've been waiting patiently.
Okay, I have something quick. Do you see any difference on amateur reviews like Yelp versus like professional reviews like Engadget, how they affect the consumers?
I think that they tend to talk about different things in many cases. Let's say that I'm thinking of buying new headphones. Okay, I'm interested in how comfortable they are. I think for that, I probably would go to, if I see 100 reviews, I probably will look for user reviews. On the other hand, if you talk about some technical specifications and comparing this model to that model, I may rely more on Engadget or CNET and so on. At the same time, there is some overlap, and I think it's not a zero-sum game. You can, and consumers, as we know, they do both. They go to expert reviews, and they go to user reviews. It's very easy to do.
Thank you all for stopping by, and we'll be able to sign some books.
Thank you.